then I'll be blue. Breaking up is hard to do. Remember when you held.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to another installment of Great Decisions. We're, of course, going to get all into the issues around Brexit today. And next week, we're going to go to the Persian Gulf, where we'll hear from our resident expert now over near the Persian Gulf, Dr. Todd Greentree. Be sure to join us for that. It's going to be good. A couple quick updates from me. As you may have noticed in last week's News Digest, I gave all kinds of hints about who our gala speaker is going to be. That identity will be released tomorrow, but because you're all joining us here today, I'll confirm we are going to have former FBI Director Jim Comey take the stage, and he will be interviewed by Valerie Plame. So that's going to be quite a fun night. That's on Wednesday, April 21st. Tickets, details, everything else goes on sale tomorrow. And of course, this is our big fundraiser every year to support our global education programs in high schools. So it's a great cause, you all know, and we look forward to seeing you and having you join us for that big night. This Thursday, we're going to go into the White House with Steve Herman, who is the VOA White House Bureau Chief, and he is going to talk all about what in the world happened to the Voice of America during the Trump administration, and of course, what the prospects are for the VOA going forward. And then next Thursday, the 18th, we get back into our Russia disruption series, and we'll be looking at the past and future of Russia-US bilateral relations with a fantastic professor from San Francisco State University, whose name I always mess when I say it, so I'm just not going to say it right now, but be sure to join us. That's going to be a good one as well. So I'm sure there's other updates to mention, but I think instead, I'm just going to bring in today's speaker, and we are going to get going. So good morning, Rich. How are you?
Just fine. Good.
It's great to see you, Rich. Of course, I'm pretty sure all of us know, but Rich is a former Assistant Attorney General in Wisconsin and has been a speaker for us in many different occasions, most notably on our Rule of Law series, where we get into all kinds of things related to rule of law in this country and abroad. And Rich, let me turn the proceedings over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Well, like many breakups, Brexit was messy and extended and to outsiders inexplicable. Understanding Brexit requires a broader historical and analytical context. Long before the embryo of the European Union formed, the United States had provided a model for how a complicated federalist system could operate. And the idea was to maintain competing federal and state sovereignties that are healthy and thriving. Well, in the US, that was always more aspirational than real, but it was a good model. Facing the immediate devastating aftermath of World War II, Churchill advocated for a, quote, United States of Europe, unquote, and other conservatives throughout Europe pushed for that vision. European liberals generally concurred, although among liberals in the 1950s, 1960s, and thereafter, even aspirational respect for local sovereignties, national sovereignties or otherwise, was diminished by the blatant racism of southern US states and memories of toxic nationalism in Germany and Italy during World War II. Many European liberals advocating transnational federalist structures in Europe viewed localized governance as provincial and federalized governance as the hope of the future. John Judas, in his excellent book, The Nationalist Revival, confirms that the critical role and force of nationalist settlements was underappreciated. But nationalism is not inherently good or bad. Lincoln, Hitler, Washington, Mussolini, Theodore Roosevelt, and Franco were all ardent nationalists. In fact, democracy in large countries would be impossible without nationalist sentiments, which create a common identity between a rancher in Wyoming, an auto worker in Michigan, a pharmacist in Florida, and a secretary in New York. People identifying themselves as American accept financial responsibility for other Americans they'll never meet, whose backgrounds are completely different. But Nationalist sentiments also can be expressed and are expressed in dark ways, fostering illiberal, nativist, and racist attitudes that demagogues can and do exploit. From the early 1990s forward, globalists pursuing what was labeled free trade often denigrated nationalism as if it was always a negative force. Globalism was too often a mask for rampant capitalism, with corporations exploiting localized and landlocked labor throughout the world. Corporations just looking for where can we exploit these laborers that really can't move around. It was easy for globalists to dismiss critiques of their actions as prejudiced provincialism. Now, over the years, the EU and its promoters likely contributed to Brexit by pursuing federalist government without properly respecting individual nations and nationalist sentiments within them. Let's look back at the history a bit. The EU had originated with the formation in 1957 of the European Economic Community, the EEC, known as the Common Market. The UK applied to join in 1963, but de Gaulle vetoed its application, claiming the UK would use the community to do the bidding of the US. The UK was allowed to join in 1973 with de Gaulle gone, but with some internal resistance already displayed in the UK, it held a non-binding referendum in 1975 on whether the UK should stay in the EEC. Of those voting, 67% voted yes, although, as a warning for the future, a significant 33% voted no. They shouldn't stay in the EEC. In 1983, the Maastricht Treaty created the European Union, based in Brussels. The EEC, renamed now the European Community, the EC, became the core of the European Union. The purpose of the European Union was to integrate Europe's nations politically and economically, including a united foreign policy, common citizenship rights, free trade within the EU nations, and with the UK being a notable exception, including also Denmark. The euro was to become a single currency. That took a few years, but that was the plan in the treaty. In 1987, Tony Blair won a stunning landslide Labour Party victory, and he strongly favored the EU. During Blair's tenure, UK-EU relations did fray over several issues. For example, Brussels banned British beef based on the mad cow scare of the late 1980s and created considerable UK resentment before the ban was grudgingly lifted based on stricter regulations. As an unabashed globalist, Blair denigrated the EU and globalism critics in ways that he denigrated the critics of the EU and globalism in ways that fed further resentment. In 2005, he dismissed people who, quote, say we have to stop and debate globalism, unquote, by saying, you may as well debate whether autumn should follow summer, unquote. And he lectured Britain that it could not, quote, resist the force of globalization and had to prepare for it and garner its vast potential benefits. Now, in 2007, the EU was running into troubles with its euro, and it needed to revise the way it was doing things. So all of the EU nations, including the UK, agreed to the Lisbon Treaty, which gave Brussels even broader powers. But with a small and vocal group of Eurosceptics in the UK, the new Labour Party Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, conspicuously missed a televised signing ceremony attended by all the other leaders. Brown had helped negotiate the treaty and later signed it in a private ceremony. He was roundly ridiculed as trying to appease everyone and please no one. More substantively, he rejected calls by UK Eurosceptics for a referendum on that treaty. Increasingly, UK Eurosceptics began to populate not just fringe parties, but the Conservative Party. As early as 2006, David Cameron, who would become Prime Minister in 2010, sought to persuade the Conservative Party to, quote, stop banging on about Europe, unquote, and instead focus on internal affairs. A good metaphor for what's happened since 2010 is the song, Should I Stay or Should I Go, which we'll refrain from playing, and the name of the group that wrote it, The Clash. As Prime Minister, Cameron turned his 2006 plea that the Conservative Party had to stop, quote, banging on about Europe into an order. Stop it. He was, for a while, able to tamp down anti-European Union actions. In October 2011, Cameron refused to even allow debate on whether to schedule a referendum on the UK leaving the EU. Instead, he unilaterally declared no referendum would be allowed because leaving the EU was, quote, the wrong answer for Britain. But in December 2011, just 3 months later, Cameron tried to appease anti-EU attitudes by vetoing an EU treaty needed to salvage the euro. I'm sorry, that's when the euro problem came in. The Lisbon Treaty was the 2007, but this treaty was needed to salvage the euro in 2011. Everyone agreed to it except Cameron, representing the UK, who vetoed that treaty. And the euro wasn't even the currency in the UK. The nearly universal view was that this veto was a major political blunder, isolating the UK within the EU. The other EU countries just responded by approving the Euro Treaty and exposed the lack of leverage in that ineffectual veto attempt, ultimately harming the UK rather than the EU or its other members. Cameron had demanded concessions from EU partners that were declined, but he hardly needed to follow up with that veto. Compounding this blunder, Cameron made remarks that ominously implied the UK's continued EU membership was dependent on whether that served UK interests. Then, in January 2013, Cameron rather bizarrely declared that, quote, democratic consent for the EU in Britain is now wafer thin, unquote, which was highly questionable. While the prime force behind the Brexit movement, the United Kingdom Independence Party, was gaining adherents, it remained a distinctly minority party. If anything, Cameron's January 2013 speech may have ballooned its ranks. That's because, apparently fearing adverse political consequences within his own party from his prior EU stances, he suddenly spun 180 degrees on the referendum issue. Just 15 months after unilaterally refusing to allow debate on whether an EU referendum should be held, he unilaterally announced that an, quote, in-out referendum would be held. Reiterating that he vigorously opposed leaving the EU, he said he planned to hold a referendum after the Conservative Party won the next election in 2015, and then successfully negotiated new terms with the EU because he believed, quote, in confronting the issue, shaping it, leading the debate, and not, quote, simply hoping a difficult situation would go away. Now, the article points out, and it's true, that at that time, the Conservative Party did not hold a majority. It was ruling with a coalition. And he hoped, according to somebody he talked to later after Brexit, that that coalition would continue after 2015, and he wouldn't have to follow through with his pledge to hold a referendum. Well, that was quite a risky and rather strange promise to make. I hope, in a sense, holding in his head, we don't win the House of Commons, so I don't have to do this referendum. But the plan he announced was to control and overcome any anti-EU attitudes by first negotiating favorable terms with the EU and then scheduling, quote, a referendum with a very simple in or out choice. That is, to either, quote, stay in the EU on these new terms he was going to negotiate, or come out altogether. In an ill-chosen phrase, he said it would be, quote, an in-out referendum, unquote. Negotiations after the 2015 election, which the party did win without any need for a coalition, did result then in some new terms. And a referendum was scheduled later for June 23rd, 2016. Another blunder, by the way, because that was the time a lot of Brits were taking holiday. In May 2016, a month before the vote, projections suggested that the referendum would, at best, just be defeated, but barely. Apparently seeking to declare victory after the vote and failing to perceive the possibility that it could go south on him, Cameron said, quote, obviously, a referendum is based on a simple majority, unquote. Brexit critics would later argue that it was far from obvious that a referendum of this magnitude should be based on a simple majority, and certainly not obvious that a vote to leave and a vote to remain were equivalent. On June 20th, 3 days before the vote, Cameron predicted victory, saying, Brits don't quit. 3 days later, a slim majority of Brits voted to do just that. There were immediate calls for a second referendum, often based on assertions that a simple majority could not decide such a fundamental issue in a binding way. But Cameron, on June 25th, 2016, not only conceded personal defeat, but declared that the issue was definitively resolved. Quote, the British people have voted to leave the European Union and their will must be respected. And it would not be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination, unquote. Essentially, he said, both the UK and I should go. 5 days after Cameron said Brits don't quit, Cameron quit and declared the Brits had quit. There was jockeying within the Conservative Party over who would succeed Cameron. The party retained its House of Commons majority, so no election was needed. And in July 2016, Home Secretary Theresa May became Prime Minister. The Brexit vote on June 23rd, 2016 had caused surprise and shock in ways similar to the US presidential election would later that year. 51.9% voted to leave and 48.1% to remain. As this map shows, all of Scotland and much of Northern Ireland voted overwhelmingly to remain, while large chunks of the Eastern Midlands in England with significantly larger populations voted overwhelmingly to leave. You know, you look at the map in the book and it shows, oh, here's folks that voted to leave, voted to remain, but look at the amount of people involved over in the Eastern Midlands. Once the votes were unpacked, the Democratic disparities were startling. Many Brexit critics blamed older voters for selling out younger UK residents. As these charts suggest, the age differential among voters was not as dramatic as for other factors, such as educational level, mean annual income, and critically, whether residents had been born in the UK. Polls did report the age differential among those supporting or opposing Brexit as far higher than among voters. But quite simply, Older populations turned out in greater numbers. Brexit critics perceived xenophobia in the Brexit vote, and there certainly was cause for that, given the campaign's rhetoric that had occurred during the Brexit debate preceding the election. There were an awful lot of xenophobic statements, posters, and campaigns presented. But deep concern and frustration regarding EU policies being imposed on the UK were definitely major factors. And it was actually predictable that people at lower economic and educational levels who felt left behind by globalism and threatened by the EU immigration policies, as well as by terrorism attacks within the UK, would strongly support Brexit. Economic concerns and fears were key. Interestingly, a later study confirmed that a good indicator of whether a region favored Brexit was not, for example, whether the local unemployment rate was high in June 2016, so much as whether there had been over the prior several years an increase in the local unemployment rate. In other words, a perception that we're getting beaten down, we're being left behind. Another strong indicator of Brexit support was whether residents were locked in place geographically by economic or educational levels or family ties or otherwise, as opposed to residents who had mobility options and who praised being British, but had the ability to move around either to jobs or locations or otherwise. So xenophobic and anti-immigrant perspectives were definitely articulated both before and after the vote, loudly and viciously by some. When one digs deeper, though, it's likely that the decades of nationalist sentiments being dismissed by globalists came home to roost. For those with not just a generalized national identity, but a core and even existential national identity, David Cameron's multiple missteps provided a forum to express anger and frustration. In retrospect, many critics questioned why the decision to leave the EU was considered resolved by a simple majority rather than 60% or 2/3 or whatever. But Cameron had called for an in-out referendum implying equivalency, and then a month before the vote declared it obvious that a simple majority would suffice. Of course, merely staying in the EU would have essentially maintained the status quo, so fine, a simple majority to stay could have resolved that issue. But voting to leave the EU was a stunning and fundamental change, and many said a simple majority simply couldn't suffice. Cameron and his successors could have justified holding a second referendum because, for example, the 1975 UK vote on whether to stay in the EEC had been expressly non-binding. But the Conservative Party, through the many years between the 2016 Brexit vote and when the UK finally left December 31st, 2020, doggedly refused to consider repeated pleas for a second referendum. Now, from early August 2016 through early August 2020, a 4-year period, YouGov, which is a highly respected polling firm, conducted a stunning 146 polls that, among other things, asked if it was right or wrong for the UK to vote to leave the EU. For a while, through up until May 2017, polls suggested bare majorities did continue to support leaving the EU. But from May 2017 on, that changed dramatically. The polls before May 25th, 2017 did show more respondents saying the decision was right rather than wrong, although the spread was always below 5% or below. But of the YouGov polls, 115 polls conducted from May 30th, 2017 through early August 2020, only 2 reported more respondents saying the decision was right rather than wrong, with one poll having a 1-point spread and the second a 2-point spread. By contrast, the other polls, the other 113 polls in that time period, had the respondents saying the decision was wrong rather than right, with over a 5% spread, wrong rather than right, in 46 of those polls. So why was the government unresponsive to the general public? Well, through implementation of Brexit, the Conservative Party apparently chose to appease vocal fringe groups rather than seek to appeal to the broader electorate. Now, upon becoming Prime Minister in July 2016, Theresa May declared unequivocally that, quote, Brexit means Brexit, and we're going to make a success of it. By October 2016, it was increasingly clear that remainder majorities in Scotland and Northern Ireland threatened to break up the UK itself, and that serious economic consequences could result from leaving the EU. But Theresa May responded, quote, even now, some politicians, democratically elected politicians, say that the referendum isn't valid, that we need to have a second vote. But come on, the referendum result was clear. It was legitimate. It was the biggest vote for change this country has ever known. Brexit means Brexit, and we're going to make a success of it. Well, in June 2017, May called a snap general election and lost her Conservative Party majority, maintaining power only by forming a coalition with a radical Northern Ireland party that had opposed the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. In January 2018, facing unexpected difficulties reaching agreements with the EU that were satisfactory to Parliament, and a March 31, 2019 deadline for leaving the EU, Theresa May defiantly declared, I am not a quitter. In November 2018, despite continuing difficulties securing satisfactory terms for leaving the EU, May again rejected calls for a second referendum. Quote, I'm clear, people voted for us to leave. We will leave, and we will leave on March 29, 2019. By then, polls had consistently, for a year and a half, reported more respondents saying the Brexit decision was wrong than right. In February 2019, she persisted in asserting that, quote, I'm clear, I am going to deliver Brexit and deliver it on time. Well, as we all observed, Parliament, after the Brexit vote, became hyperpolarized and rejected each proposal Theresa May brought back from her EU negotiations. By May 2019, she admitted defeat. Unable to, quote, deliver Brexit, she said, it is in the best interest of the UK for a new PM to lead that effort. Well, contra history, that was another opportunity, particularly with polls over the prior 2 years, repeatedly showing strong opposition to leaving the EU, to consider a second referendum. That may have disrupted the governing coalition, the Conservative Party and the radical Northern Ireland Party, but polls reflected an overall supportive public. Theresa May, though, said not just that she should go, but the UK should go. With a Conservative Party Prime Minister resigning and the fragile governing coalition still in the majority, the new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, was appointed without any general election. The new deadline for leaving the EU was October 31st, 2019, and Johnson repeatedly declared that absolutely no more extensions would be tolerated. Well, on June 25th, 2019, for example, he said the UK would, quote, come out of the EU on October the 31st, do or die come what may. Over an amazing 3 days in early September 2019, Johnson purged Brexit moderates from the Conservative Party, a Trumpian move that shocked many, and declared that there are no, quote, no circumstances in which I will ask Brussels to delay, that we are, quote, leaving on October 31st, no ifs or buts, that, quote, we will leave on 31 October in all circumstances, that there will, quote, be no further pointless delay, and that, quote, I'd rather be dead in a ditch than delay leaving the EU. Well, as October 31st approached, EU negotiations were not going well. In late October, Parliament, facing the devastating prospect of a hard exit on October 31st, that is, the EU leaving the EU without any deal, Parliament passed a law requiring Johnson to request another extension. Well, for a while, Johnson threatened to create a constitutional crisis by defying that law. Finally, on October 20th, his government sent the EU an unsigned letter requesting an extension that Johnson characterized as, quote, Parliament's letter, unquote, while he signed a second letter telling the EU any extension would be a, quote, mistake, unquote. The EU granted the requested extension. After that, rather than back down and try to work with either Parliament or the EU, Johnson decided to roll the dice by scheduling a general election for December 12th, 2019, risking that either his purged Conservative Party would be defeated or that he might obtain a mandate on Brexit. Polls before and after the election reported an electorate saying the Brexit decision was wrong. But the Labour Party self-destructed spectacularly. And Johnson's campaign, as stunt-oriented as Johnson himself, was, as the British say, brilliant. The central campaign ad was to, quote, get Brexit done, literally in capital letters. Let's look at the start of a campaign ad.
Let's do this. You'll have seen me driving through that polystyrene wall with this incredible digger. That's what we've got to do on Thursday in just 2 days' time. Break the deadlock, take this country forward. Let's get Brexit done. Vote Conservative on Thursday.
Well, the rest of that ad, which was about 2 minutes long or more, echoed in the voters' ears by promising many things that Johnson would get, quote, done, again in capital letters, if elected. After Johnson had become prime minister, his disapproval ratings had always exceeded his approval ratings. On November 19th, 2019, just weeks before that election, 49% disapproved while 40% approved. But an election day poll reported a reversal, 47% approval to 41% disapproval. And the Conservative Party not only won, it secured an 80-vote majority over the Labour Party, and therefore was no longer beholden to fringe groups. Polls did not show Brexit suddenly becoming popular. Rather, the Conservative Party winning, rather than the Conservative Party winning, the Labour Party resoundingly lost. And UK voters were more likely wowed by Johnson's carnival-style ads than they're having become Brexit supporters. But with the voters having nonetheless voted for Johnson's purged Conservative Party, his approval ratings exceeded disapproval ratings for several months thereafter. At the same time, other polls were reflecting the public continuing to view the Brexit decision itself as wrong rather than right. Now, in January 2020, the EU and the UK agreed to a withdrawal agreement that anticipated negotiations and more specific agreements and called for the UK to leave on December 31st, 2020. The prospect of a hard exit still existed, but it was lessened through that withdrawal agreement. And the public continued to view the Brexit decision as more wrong than right. The public finally soured on Johnson himself, and from June 2020 through today, more poll respondents have regularly disapproved than approved of Johnson, with those disapproval ratings never dipping below 50%. Throughout 2020, given Johnson's proclivities, the most likely prospect remained a hard exit. In October 2020, Johnson touted a hard exit option, contending that the UK would, quote, prosper mightily as an independent free trading nation, controlling our own borders, our fisheries, and setting our own laws, unquote. That's through a hard exit. A poll that month showed 59% disapproving of Johnson and 34% approving. Now, surprising a lot of people, on December 24th, 2020, the EU and the UK did finally reach an agreement. It was an agreement. Though Johnson hailed the deal, it was almost universally panned in the UK as being inadequate and preferable only to having no deal at all. Even Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage called the deal, quote, far from perfect, and for fisheries in particular, a, quote, rotten deal, unquote. A controversial provision that seemed to almost invite Northern Ireland to ultimately break away was setting a EU trade line in the Irish Sea rather than along the border with the Republic of Ireland. A January 2021 New York Times analysis perceptively observed that perhaps the biggest danger for Britain, quote, is that it is now stranded awkwardly, half in, half out of the European economic system, leaving its relationship with the bloc as fraught and politically combustible as ever, unquote. And that, quote, a big economy that shares a land border with Ireland, a European Union country, Britain will be unable to escape the huge trading bloc's gravitational pull, unquote. Well, that in the few months since December 31, that seems to be an accurate analysis. We'll see how that plays out. Numerous problems and tensions have developed in those few short months. Johnson was widely criticized for an example, in February 2021, characterizing those problems and tensions as just, quote, teething problems. Even Ian Paisley Jr., for those of an age, you remember his father, Ian Paisley, in Northern Ireland. Ian Paisley Jr., who is a rabid advocate for Brexit in Northern Ireland, said that Johnson had, quote, ruined trade in Northern Ireland, and that it was an insult to our intelligence to say it was teething problems. Despite Johnson having avoided a hard exit at the end of December, a poll that month in February 2021 reported disapproval of him at 52%, approval at 41%. So will we sometime in the next few years see Johnson saying, I should go? Among the most dramatic consequences of Brexit could be the UK itself breaking up. As noted earlier, voters throughout Scotland in June 2016 voted overwhelmingly against leaving the EU. And less overwhelmingly, Northern Ireland also voted to remain rather than leave. As terms of the deal negotiated by Johnson play out excruciatingly in real time, Scotland is chomping at the bit to declare independence, prevented from bursting out of the gate only because Parliament controls the gate. There is even a growing potential that Northern Ireland will choose to break away. Now, here in this slide is a compilation of polling in Scotland and Northern Ireland conducted in January 2021. I do want to say the poll in Northern Ireland is a little suspect. It's been criticized, but nonetheless, it's the best we have right now. Polls reflect that Scots would vote for independence tomorrow if given the chance, and that when compared to past polls from several years ago, Northern Ireland is dramatically moving slowly but steadily towards wanting to break out of the UK, particularly its younger residents. A major barricade in Scotland is that after voting in 2014 to stay within the UK, the timing of any further independence vote is controlled by Parliament, which is none too ready to allow that vote anytime soon. The precarious hold that Johnson and the Conservative Party have on government is ultimately the key to Scotland's future. To stay in power, the Conservative Party may need the support of the Scottish Independence Party. Alternately, the Labour Party, which has now cleaned up its act, could prevail whenever the next general election is held in the UK, but only if it obtains support from the Scottish Independence Party. In either case, the price would be allowing Scotland to vote on independence. If Scotland becomes independent and joins the EU, that would increase the odds that Northern Ireland would also leave, if only because the UK would then be more geographically distant. Regardless of what Scotland does, Northern Ireland could decide to leave the UK. Polls do not yet show more support for leaving than staying, but predictions are, with Johnson's blundering actions, that threshold may be crossed within a relatively short period of time. If Northern Ireland breaks with the UK, where would it land? Given its fraught history with the Republic of Ireland, it could remain a country separate from the Republic, with each being EU members, for example. But Northern Ireland and the Republic could become one country. Northern Ireland is becoming more Catholic than Protestant, the trends are showing. And among younger Northern Irelanders, economic concerns take precedent over religious differences. Another fact that I think highly significant, though I haven't seen analysts pick up on it, is that the two countries on the island have for decades fielded all Ireland professional sports teams consisting of players from both countries. Sports may resonate deeper than religion. And even regarding religious issues, the heads of the Protestant and Catholic churches on the island each serve the entire island. Northern Ireland increasingly has far more in common with the Republic than England. At long last, Ireland could return to being one nation. What about the EU? Well, whenever a long-term intimate relationship ends, both sides of the relationship are impacted. Interestingly, as the article reflects, the EU has lost a good chunk of economic heft with the UK departure, but has reworked itself into a tighter, more cohesive team of nations that, ironically, is displaying more sensitivity to nationalist sentiments within the remaining member nations. The effects of Brexit are going to play out over many years within the UK, in the EU itself, and around the world. The ultimate irony, and the more permanent irony, would be, though, if the nationalist sentiments displayed in England through Brexit results in two nations now within the UK breaking free of its confines based on their own nationalist sentiments.
Well, thank you, Rich. That was a great presentation on truly an incredibly complicated issue. I want to encourage folks out there to ask questions in the chat. Find the raise your hand button, which can be confusing in the Zoom meeting function. If you can't find it, just put raise hand into the chat window and I will unmute you when the time comes. So Rich, last night, my wife and I watched the Meghan and Harry interview with Oprah. And I don't want to necessarily dive into that, but one thing that obviously came out of that was how much race is a factor, not only within the royal family, but far beyond. And the article talks about the issue of race, and it also touches on, the incredible message of we send the EU 350 million pounds a week. Let's fund our NHS instead, which was not based in fact. So let's talk about race. Is race a major issue in the driver of Brexit, in the ongoing imperatives of Brexit, to stop those Turkish refugees, to stop how much of a factor is race in modern England and in Brexit?
Well, it's folks far more knowledgeable than I would have to really address how much it is playing a role. I have read a great deal about the role of race, how it's being expressed, etc. I kind of conclude that it is a major factor in Brexit having been pushed and ultimately adopted, and then in the Conservative Party particularly not having pulled back at the many times that it could have from implementing Brexit, giving some exit ramps that were not exiting from the EU, but exiting from the Brexit. There were many opportunities that were consciously avoided. And I do think that those racial attitudes were present and are present, and the polls and the studies show it. But as with the critiques of Trump being elected and the Trump supporters being quote unquote racist, I think it's much more complicated. And I do think it goes to economic concerns, to the fact that people who were Brexit supporters, for example, were kind of locked in place geographically, economically, and otherwise, and felt that they were being assaulted from many fronts, including immigration, which is a major driver, immigration concerns, terrorism concerns. So ultimately, I think it's impossible to pull the threads apart and end up saying, hey, look, this is the racist part. I think it all connects together. But criticizing Trump supporters, just like Brexit supporters, by saying, it's all based on racism, I think is far too simplistic.
Right. And yet there may well have been some folks who responded to the immigration side of this. I was hearing a podcast yesterday where I don't remember what year it was from, but Trump was blaming pretty much all of America's problems on immigrants and on leaky borders. And then I just wonder, I know there are some really smart people who believe categorically in how important the Leave agenda is. I just wonder, in reading an article like this, and of course in reading the news, whether the Leave supporters have ultimately been sold a bill of goods that's not reflected in evidence and facts and so on. Do you believe ultimately that the argument for the Leave has been is a bit stilted and a bit contorted and obviously infused by political agenda?
Well, I think yes. I think in many ways similar to how there were dog whistles and demagogic statements made in the US over the last several years. That also occurred in in Britain. It certainly occurred before the Brexit vote. There were some really nasty ads and posters that were presented that were completely untrue, but that resonated with people that were fearful of their economic conditions and the conditions for the future of the country. I do think, though, that for a lot of people, both here and in Britain, the feeling, the almost existential dedication to a nation had a tremendous impact on how people felt about leaving, even at their own. And now we have Brexit playing out, the consequences of Brexit playing out, and it's hurting people economically at the very level of the Leave supporters. But if you were to go to those very folks and say, do you think that was the right vote? They might well say, yes, it's proper to have left because we've got to defend Britain, even though their own economic state may be hurting. Hard to know.
Question here from Paul Woolworth around trade, and she asks, can you briefly describe the chief issues in this negotiation beyond fisheries? What are some of the other potential trade barriers in this version of Brexit?
That could take a while. It is complicated, and I don't know that I can do that justice. The trade issues are major and kind of changing as we speak too, because we have the EU kind of playing around with the vaccine distribution, and the UK imposing controls on the border, and the border being in the Irish Sea, by the way, between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, jamming up customs, and now they suspended. I just saw that they suspended that for a while because they were getting so much blowback. I'm sorry. I think I'm missing the question there. Let me go to that.
Just other major trade barriers and other blockages.
Oh, well, it's interesting. One of the major things that has occurred is that the financial services industry was told, you don't even need to worry about any of this. It'll all be fine. Well, they are finding that there are barriers in what they can do between nations. And so you end up with quite a few of the financial services sectors moving to Dublin, which of course feeds into the concept of possible Northern Ireland independence, Paris and elsewhere, and London losing its major role in the financial services sector.
Yeah, that seems to me to be one of the most foolish parts of Brexit. London is truly, you could make a case for being the capital of global financial markets. And, I can't forecast how that would change under Brexit, but wow, what a crazy thing to risk for London, yes. Not only in terms of finances, but just in terms of the kinds of people that gravitate to London and the amazing sort of creme de la creme that comes from all over Europe to be in its financial capital. And I don't know if you have thoughts on whether, financial, beyond moving to some other areas, but, is this going to hit London and of course the UK more profoundly with Brexit? Is it going to be harder for capital to be based in London? And what are your thoughts on that?
There are quite a few places. It's going both ways at this point. We're only a few months into the actual breakup right now, but it's going, we're getting predictions in different ways. People are saying, fine, we'll move our headquarters, financial services folks, we're going to move our headquarters to Dublin, Paris, etc. But we'll still have our offices in London, we'll be interconnected, everything will be fine. But the gravity is moving outside the UK. The synergy of those headquarters being together in London won't be there anymore. That's going to shake out in a lot of interesting ways. One thing that has been talked about is how the EU, with England as part of it, had a tremendous economic force, and it has lost a lot of that force because England, a major economy, is no longer involved, is no longer part of it. But one could say the EU is going to be the old leaner, meaner entity that can appeal, and potentially, if it grabs enough of that financial sector into Paris and Dublin, et cetera, be able to play the major role it was playing before.
So we have a couple questions coming in here, but before I ask them, I do want to ask the question that's in the handbook, the second question, which is, what happens to the United States in terms of its relationships with not only the UK, but with the EU? What are some of I know that's a hard one to answer simply, but what are some of the aspects the United States in terms of its foreign policy should be thinking about, when and if this all, comes to a formal conclusion?
Of course, the analysis of that question changed pretty dramatically on January 20th. Had Trump been reelected, the dynamics would have been much different, both between the US and the UK and the US and the EU. It looks as if the Biden administration is going to continue making it clear that Northern Ireland, UK, do not mess with the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. That would be a non-starter to even think about. The UK is attempting to interact financially and trade-wise with the US so that Johnson can fulfill his promise that this is going to be a great deal for the UK. That's not working out so well. And I think the US is playing a very, it's early, but I think they are playing a very careful game of working with the UK, which always has had a special relationship and probably always will, but working closely with the EU as well. And I perceive, particularly with Secretary of State Blinken, that there's going to be a lot of nuanced negotiations and probably very few missteps as they work through these things. That they won't. I don't see the U.S. playing off the UK against the EU, but I think that Blinken and others will look at American interests and pursue those independently in those two places.
Yeah. Question I'll build on here through Virginia McCallum is, are there rumblings from other EU countries saying, well, hey, hang on a second, maybe our interests are best served by getting out of the Union?
That was a major concern right after Brexit. The Brexit vote occurred. I don't, from everything I'm reading, I don't see that happening. And in fact, I think if anything, the EU government in Brussels has become far more sensitive to nationalist interests. Sometimes, unfortunately so. For example, with the problem with Hungary and Poland wanting to back away from the rule of law requirements that the EU has in place and that are central to the whole concept of the EU. The EU didn't blink, but they delayed dealing with the rule of law issues. And I think that probably came in part from concerns about countries backing out of the EU. They want to keep them all together, and I think that is their primary goal at this point, as well as having good governance. But the EU as a whole seems to have become more sensitive to the needs of its members, and I think that's going to continue.
Great question here from Mike Daly and Ellen Boozer, which reflects a topic I want to talk about more and more and more every day, which is around money laundering, around the role of the Channel Islands in being a home to some hidden wealth, let's call it. Any idea how Brexit affects that at all?
There's a good question. There's a very good question. And no, I haven't seen anything about that in the analysis I've been reading recently, but I can see that could be a very interesting development, with the UK being out of, not only out of the EU, but having difficulties negotiating anything with the EU. It just seems to be this very intense, polarized negotiations whenever anything is occurring. And so getting down to into the weeds on issues such as money laundering, maybe it'll be an easy one for the UK and the EU to deal with, but I doubt it. I think, frankly, unless and until there is a different government in the UK, everything will be fraught between the EU and the UK in ways that will be disruptive. It's the first few months have proven that to be true, far more than teething problems. And I'm afraid that type of thing could occur. And in that regard, you have opportunists who want to play with money laundering, who are no doubt looking at those very issues right now.
Right. Question here from David, and I'm going to guess this is David Warham, who's an Englishman here in Santa Fe. And David, I would love to hear some of your thoughts if you want to share them, because I know
Please.
Yeah. So David asks, with Brexit, the UK is no longer restricted from trade with other countries. Do you see less or more or the same levels of trade with the United States as a consequence?
Say, Sandy, any chance of turning on his mic? Let's hear.
David,
if he's willing.
We'd love to hear from you, David. I don't put you on the spot. Why don't we talk about this question and David can chime in if.
All righty. All right.
Are there restrictions? What is the prospect for US-UK trade, given that Brexit opens up the door to fewer restrictions on trade from and with?
Right. Again, I think what you're going to see is the US looking at its own overall interests, part of which could be maintaining the special relationship it has had with the UK, just from a traditional historical viewpoint. But I think far more, if you increase trade with the UK, does that help out the US, et cetera? I did see an interesting article about Scotland. They were pointing out, hey, we'll be able to sell Scotch without all the barriers we've had before. Once we're out of the UK. And so once we're out of the EU, it was one advantage that was being perceived up there. But overall, I think the US will likely look at its own interests and pursue those.
Let's talk about the National Health Service for a minute. Obviously, it was a pretty central plank within the Leave campaign. What has been the effect on the NHS? And there is no certain, this is from Virginia McCallum, certainly there was and is no new money pouring into it, which was one of the promises. So what are the prospects? How has the NHS fared? How will the NHS fare given everything that has been promised?
Well, everything that has been promised, and as with the rest of the world, the COVID pandemic and all of the economic consequences of dealing with the COVID issues. There was a big brouhaha about the UK hoarding vaccines. The EU was very upset with that, hoarding vaccines for their own people. But the deeper issue really is what is going to happen to the NHS, because the UK economy is not tanking, but it is, I just read an article this morning, is definitely hurting dramatically based on the Brexit exit. And so if that continues, continuing to be able to fund the NHS and other priorities at the level they have been is going to be more difficult. And I think it's very perceptive to see that is something to definitely be watching in over the next several months.
Great question here from David King. I had forgotten about this, and it's wonderful. How deep was the Russian involvement with the Brexit vote? We know some things about that, but I don't know. Tell us if you know anything additional about Russia's involvement in some.
I don't have any secret knowledge, and I don't know. I'm sure it was significant. I think there's been definitely, it's been established there was Russian involvement, and basically Russia has turned from world domination under Khrushchev to world disruption under Putin. And the ability to disrupt the UK government through Brexit was, I'm sure, high on the priorities of those in Russia. The fact that it's known some involvement occurred, it's fair to assume a lot more involvement occurred. That's about all I can say about it, I think.
Yeah, no, that sounds right. I'm trying to remember exactly. I think, you know, Cambridge Analytica had a role in terms of identifying British preferences and so on, and then targeting messages appropriately to those audiences. But I want to find out more about that. So that's a good one for us to put our finger on and come back to.
That would be.
Let me ask you one final question, and it's a good one. It's also from Virginia, and she says, if Brexit doesn't work, lots of reasons why it may not work, can the UK come back into the EU, and what would that look like?
It's interesting. There have been people broaching that with the EU, and never say never, but the EU itself is essentially saying, you said you wanted to leave, you've left. And that's the message that the EU has been consistently sending. However, again, the UK economy is a large one, and politicians change their minds. So you could have down the road with a new UK government, an attempt to come back into the EU. I don't see that happening. I think the UK is going to stay out. There are far too many issues that have occurred and far too many polarizing attitudes that are now locked in place in England. But it could happen. I think the more likely thing is there will be continuing blundering, consistent with the blundering we've seen over the past several years, and that Scotland will end up becoming independent and Northern Ireland may. I think that's what's ultimately going to happen, and England and Wales will become the UK. I think that's far more likely than the UK deciding to come back into the EU and the EU allowing them to come back in.
Yeah, fascinating times. It seems to me, if we connect the dots with what we just went through for the last 4 years here, that we're faced in this moment in time with the reality of globalization. It's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. And we can go on the pendulum swing of saying, well, actually, we're not going to be part of the global economy, and we're going to keep immigrants out, and we're going to do everything we can to keep our elbows out and put England first or America first. And I get where that reaction comes from, but it seems like the best response for any sort of modern nation state is to say, globalization's here. People are moving. The pandemic has shown how incredibly fluid work can be, and how borders are are irrelevant in some aspects. And so
Mhm.
I just wonder if this is part of their pendulum swing in the UK of saying, well, if being in the EU represents embracing globalization and then Brexit, and I want somebody to disagree with this, but that Brexit sort of
Mhm.
rejects globalization, I wonder if they'll kind of come back to a middle ground and say, well, actually, we need to implement policies and create a country that fully embraces globalization while also, pushing away the more negative effects, but
Right.
positioning England and positioning the UK to succeed in this time of incredibly interwoven economies and populaces and so on.
I agree to a point. I think it does have to come from both sides. Globalization is here to stay, but Brexit and the Trump phenomenon show that if you suppress those nationalist sentiments, there will be reactions, and they will not be nice reactions. Yeah. If you work, and we have this, the whole idea of federalism is to be able to have a federal government and local governments that respect one another and work with one another. And we didn't have that. And I think Brexit sends the message, and the Trump years send the message. We have to rethink how we put that balance back in place and really work with one another. How Britain and whether England and Wales, Wales kind of following the tail, being the tail, but whether England and Wales end up making the changes that are necessary to become part of the global economy again in a really effective and healthy way, I don't give that a lot of hope. Yeah. But whether the EU and other global networks have realized what they need to do to respect their constituent parts and their constituent sovereignties, that's the real, in some ways, the real silver lining here. I think the EU is getting it.
Well, Rich Moriarty, thank you so much. I have now two new ideas that I think we need to explore in live streams. One is I'd love to have somebody who believes strongly that Brexit is the way forward for the UK. I'd love to hear the arguments. I'd love to have a conversation, because I think it's easy to glom onto the parts of this that don't quite sit right. But I know that there are other parts within the Brexit agenda that do fit.
I think Boris will be available if you want. Yeah.
That man's voice, I love it. I would love to listen to that man's voice for an hour. But and then the other one, and maybe we'll ask this next Thursday when we're talking about Russia, is really getting back into that issue of, what has Russia been doing behind the scenes in the UK to influence the agenda for its own purposes. Fascinating stuff.
It is.
Well, thank you, Rich. As always, greatly appreciated. And,
thank you.
And then, folks, we're going to the Persian Gulf on Tuesday. This coming Thursday, we're going to go into the White House. And then Thursday the 18th, we'll, of course, be talking about Russia and the United States. I have another talk that I'm about to announce, the sponsor from the World Food Program on April 1st. And we'll be looking at Central America, food insecurity, and climate change. Super interesting topic. So we'll see you on Thursday, and we'll see you, for all of our programs coming up. Great to have you all here. Have a fine day, and we'll see you soon. Bye.